Let me introduce our keynote speaker, Jennifer Gandhi, who is a professor at the Department of Political Science at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale University. So, Jennifer's research interests are in comparative politics and global political economy, with a special focus on authoritarian regimes, which is a topic of our conference. And also, Jennifer is focusing on transitions to and from democracy. Professor Gandhi's work includes award-winning Cambridge University book, Political Institutions Under Dictatorship. So I heavily relied on that framework in my own dissertations a while ago. So, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one, actually, maybe even in this room. Jennifer Gandhi published extensively, and also including the leading journals, the American Journal of Political Science and the Journal of Politics. So without any further ado, let me invite Jennifer to the stage, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you. After Frank and Palu, that's an incredibly difficult act to follow, but I will try. First, thank you to the organizers, Margarita and Eleni, for inviting me to the conference and for the opportunity to share and hear reflections on resisting authoritarianism. As someone who studies authoritarianism, but not in the region, I look forward to learning more from you today and throughout the next few days in various panels. Let me start with 3 statements that came from the annual report from the Varieties of Democracy, which is a global data collection effort that measures political institutions around the globe. First, the level of democracy enjoyed by the average person in the world in 2023 is down to 1985 levels. Second, since 2009, almost 15 years in a row, the share of the world's population living in autocratizing countries has overshadowed the share living in democratizing countries. And third, the decline is starkest in Eastern Europe and South and Central Asia. Their report goes on to sound the alarm about how more and more countries are undergoing what they call autocratization, whether it is autocracies that are becoming more closed or democracies that are eroding from within. And so today, inspired by those statements and statements very similarly made by other academics and practitioners, I would like to discuss 3 questions. First, how did we get here? Second, given how we got here, how might this impact how we approach the study of political regimes, particularly in the social sciences? And third, is there any reason for optimism? Because my work is cross-national or focuses on countries outside the region, I will address these questions from a comparative perspective, and I'm happy to discuss further whether any of these lessons actually apply to the region of Eurasia. First, how did we get here? In much of the contemporary political science literature on regimes, a major inflection point was the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and East Central Europe. The disintegration of the political systems and economic systems that had characterized the Eastern Bloc had a ripple effect that transformed the politics of many developing countries. I don't have to relate to what happened. I don't have to relate to you what happened in the region, but it's important to note that the effect of the end of communism in this region of the world had tremendous impact outside of the region. The end of a bipolar geopolitical scene meant that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia no longer had the Eastern Bloc as a trading partner, as a place for educational exchanges, or as a source of military, infrastructural, and humanitarian assistance. These developing countries also observed the collapse of an economic model built around state planning that many of them had tried to emulate after the end of World War II and after their own independence. They also witnessed the demise of a political system that many of them had tried to imitate. That is, regimes in which all political activity was centered around the governing party because all forms of opposition were subject to tight formal or informal controls. With the end of the Cold War, the flip side of the coin was that these developing countries now faced a unipolar world in which the only superpower left standing was the one demanding political and economic liberalization in exchange for financial assistance. The consequence was that many countries in the developing world transformed politically. Countries such as Kenya and Indonesia went from having a single party that dominated political life and elections that returned popular votes of 90% and over, to become regimes that seemed to allow for more pluralism, more institutions, more rules that we typically associate with democracy. They allowed other parties to form outside the state and to contest elections to win control of the state. And incumbent leaders started to win elections with more modest vote shares. In fact, it was often the case that because so many candidates and parties entered the electoral fray, incumbents often won elections with a mere plurality of votes. In political science, the transformation was known as the change from single-party or dominant party regimes to what are often referred to as competitive authoritarian regimes, or electoral autocracies. These countries were still regarded as dictatorships because the ruling party often continued to maintain power by winning elections, but greater freedom for civil society to organize and for independent political parties to contest elections. And these were seen as important markers of change. In the 15 years after the end of the Cold War, again, according to the Varieties of Democracy project, the frequency of closed autocracies, those autocracies that banned political parties and other forms of pluralism, the frequency of those types of regimes in the world was cut in half, mostly replaced by these electoral autocracies. For incumbents in electoral autocracies, having to deal with opposition parties and mass suffrage makes the job of staying in power a little bit harder. In other words, they have to do some work to win elections. The contemporary literature on autocracies in political science shows that in many ways, incumbents in electoral autocracies behave like their counterparts in democracies. They provide constituency service and enact popular policies. They use political parties to help them mobilize voters. But these incumbents also differ from their democratic counterparts in important ways. When efforts at governance do not win enough popular support, they have other tools. They need agents and allies to help them buy votes, commit fraud, repress opposition. They use their resources to reward these agents and allies, but they also may need to use their resources to co-opt the opposition. Access to these strategies makes the playing field very tilted in the favor of incumbents in electoral autocracies, but that does not mean these strategies are easy or free of costs. Using repression means empowering the security sector, which one day may turn against the incumbent. Engaging in fraud at the local level helps incumbents win at the polls, but may make it difficult to use election results to gain information about areas of strength for the incumbent and the opposition alike. Distributing political offices and rents to divide and conquer the opposition may leave less for regime elites whose support autocratic leaders must maintain. As a result, we often observe many incumbent parties and leaders survive in office even after the transition from single or dominant party rule to electoral authoritarianism. But elections sometimes demonstrate the limits of their popular support as well as their power to compel it. And sometimes these elections enable the opposition to make a breakthrough, as I will discuss when reflecting on reasons for optimism. The second development that brought us to where we are is the emergence of chief executives who are elected in what appear to be free and fair elections, so not in electoral autocracies, but who then proceed to erode any constraints on their power, whether it is the press, the courts, or the opposition. My colleague Milan Zvolek has labeled this executive takeover, or incumbent-driven subversion of democracy. More popularly, This process has been labeled democratic backsliding or democratic erosion, signifying, as Frank said, a slow, steady movement away from democratic practices, with the ultimate coup de grace being the incumbent's ability to use elections to get himself systematically reelected. In some sense, going from a democrat to an electoral autocrat. Two things about democratic backsliding are of note. First, again, the end of the Cold War serves as an inflection point. Before the early 1990s, military coups were the predominant way in which democracies would fall. After the end of the Cold War, executive takeovers became the predominant way that democracies are subverted. Almost 30 years after the end of the Cold War, almost 90% of all democratic breakdowns are due to incumbent-led erosion from within. Political scientists in the US, at least, have turned away from studying electoral authoritarianism to focus on democratic backsliding. They have no doubt been motivated by what they see in their own country, particularly with the rise of Donald Trump. But this trend is the result of several cases around the world, including Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and Modi in India. Second, what is particularly insidious about democratic backsliding is the way in which it unfolds. Again, referring to many of the practices that Frank pointed out. Kim Lane-Schepele, a legal theorist, has aptly called the strategy of incumbents who subvert democracy from within, quote, autocratic legalism. As she describes it, quote, some constitutional democracies are being deliberately hijacked by a set of legally clever autocrats who use constitutionalism and democracy to destroy both, end quote. In other words, they use the law and institutional procedures to, quote unquote, reform all the institutions that try to check their power, whether it is a legislature controlled by the opposition, courts that promote constitutionalism, or an electoral management body that enforces electoral law to promote a level playing field for all parties. They also use the law and institutional procedures to undermine the rights of all those who disagree with them by using libel laws to silence critical journalists, by using the excuse of law and order to curtail where and when people can protest, and by labeling as extremist civil society organizations that attempt to retain their independence. I will not go into more details. Frank enumerated a number of these examples, and one need only open a newspaper these days to read about them. So here we are, a world in which democracy seems in retreat because of the rise of electoral autocracies and more recently, the rise of democratic backsliding or erosion. So what impact might these developments have on our study of political regimes in the social sciences? First, I should note there are insightful, rich literatures on both of these topics, so here I offer just a few passing thoughts. The combination of political pluralism and national-level elections, or what's called the rise of electoral autocracies, was heralded as a relatively new phenomenon after the end of the Cold War. But in fact, it was not. If we examine the data historically, back to the 1800s, we see that the post-Cold War period of parties and elections at the national level is in fact not the anomaly at all. Competing parties and elections that do not result in democratic turnover were quite common in Latin America throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, and in Europe during the interwar period. So in reality, it is the complete formal shutdown of opposition parties and elections during the Cold War period that is actually the historical anomaly. For political scientists who adopt a minimalist conception of democracy and focus on electoral institutions as the primary distinction between political regimes, the Cold War, as this historically anomalous period, made our jobs easier, in the sense that it was very easy to distinguish between dictatorships and democracies. Military regimes that abrogated their country's constitutions and closed Congress were easily identified as dictatorships. So were single-party regimes that banned all other political parties. But now, With electoral autocracies, we have a regime that bears some similarities to democracies, especially those that are backsliding or eroding from within. Given the similarities between electoral autocracies and backsliding democracies, the study of the two regime types curiously talk past each other, I think, in two ways. First, the literature on democratic backsliding has focused extensively on leaders: Trump, Orban, Erdogan, Modi, Lopez Obrador. How these leaders use populist appeals to gather support for their agendas, how these leaders demonize particular groups within society, and how they use the institutions of democracy, referenda, decrees, and legislation to aggrandize their power and undermine democracy. But what the literature on authoritarianism teaches us is that no ruler comes to power and stays in power without the help of elites. Moreover, the nature of rule under autocracy often depends on the balance of power between the leader and the elites, which can change over time. And that the nature of rule differs by who is dominant among the elite, whether it's political elites, military elites, or financial elites. In other words, the relationship among different groups of elites and the leader is critically important for understanding how autocracies work. So, what I think that our study of backsliding in democracy needs more of is a focus on other actors besides the leader, namely the economic, social, political, and sometimes military elites who help leaders come to power and then also help them erode the institutional constraints and electoral competition that is meant to check their power. We talk about oligarchs in autocracies, but they are there in democracies as well. We examine how elites within the governing party help autocrats survive in power, but they also do the same in democracies that are eroding, often carrying out the strategy of autocratic legalism by passing legislation and mobilizing popular support for the incumbent. Second, besides leaders, I think another strong area of focus for the scholarship on democratic backsliding is citizens. Studies of backsliding in political science, at least, lay a lot of blame on citizens. They blame citizens for being the ones who vote for would-be autocrats into power. They blame citizens for being the ones who re-elect them, even after they have revealed their true colors. They also blame citizens for the ones who prioritize partisanship, policy preferences, competency, order, growth, good governance, all of these things over democratic rule. In my view, much of the literature on autocracies, in contrast, takes a very different approach to thinking about citizens. Literature on autocracy that focuses on the preference falsification of citizens due to repression, the work that examines censorship and propaganda under the notion that citizens' beliefs are distorted by these regime tactics. What is implicit in this work is that if people had unfettered access to information and the unrestricted ability to express themselves, they would behave like good Democrats. They would choose democracy, or at the very least choose as their leader someone other than someone who becomes an autocrat. What is preventing them from doing so are the repressive and distortionary actions of political actors and governments. In other words, the problem is one of state versus society. But if you think about the literature on backsliding, which portrays citizens as being sort of the villains in the story, perhaps it's worth interrogating our ideas about citizens under dictatorship. What if people are fine living under autocratic government? More so, what if they are fine with allowing for repression of other groups within society? Once the problem is no longer about the state versus society, but also about how different parts of society contest each other, how to think about and organize resistance becomes much more complicated. Finally, putting aside the finer points of academic debates, is there any reason for optimism? I have optimism, tempered optimism, although I confess, I think I study what I do to try to find a reason to be optimistic. I've studied opposition parties contesting elections in electoral autocracies, and I tend to focus on cases in which opposition parties get close or they sometimes topple autocratic incumbents, because I want to learn from those cases and think about how those lessons can be exported to other areas. That's my reason for optimism. So I had an especially fulfilling experience on this topic while working as a collaborator on a research project about electoral competition in Malaysia. And although it's a place that's very far from the region, I just wanted to share some reflections based on that experience. First, some very quick background for people unfamiliar with the case. So since the 1950s, Malaysia was ruled by the same party, the United Malays National Organization, UMNO, and its smaller allies, making it one of the prime examples of a dominant party dictatorship during the Cold War period. Other parties were legally allowed to contest regular elections, which were held every 4 to 5 years. But UMNO and its allies always handily won a legislative majority, and sometimes a supermajority, allowing them to form the government and often change the constitution at will. By 2008, UMNO was electorally vulnerable, but it was still able to win regularly held elections for 2 reasons. As expected, like other electoral autocracies, it unfairly wielded the tools of gerrymandering, vote buying, and fraud against the opposition. But second, opposition parties consistently fielded separate candidates who would often split voter support in elections. So they essentially shot themselves in the foot time and again. Before the 2018 general election, however, 4 opposition parties agreed to form an electoral coalition in which the member parties agreed to field only 1 legislative candidate in each district to face the governing party candidate. At the time, we were doing a survey among Malaysian voters, trying to understand what factors would influence their willingness to support a candidate from the coalition who was not their partisan preference, since this type of cross-party voting was the only way in which the coalition would be able to win the election. Right up until election day itself, most media sources and polls predicted that UMNO and its allies would manage to win the election again. I remember this point extremely well because we were writing up the results of our survey when the election occurred. And we had originally framed the paper as an analysis for how UMNO won the election yet again. But miraculously, the opposition coalition pulled off the narrowest of victories, and with that, over 60 years of UMNO rule were over. I have to say, I've never been so happy to do a rewrite of a paper. So, change can happen. And while the Malaysian example is certainly uncommon, it is not a singular example of opposition-driven change through the ballot box. Some other examples. After decades of fighting amongst themselves, opposition parties formed a similar type of electoral coalition before the 2002 election in Kenya. That coalition won, again ending decades of dominant party rule. The opposition came the closest it has ever come to toppling Erdogan in Turkey through a similar electoral coalition in the most recent election. And while they fell short, the opposition has made gains at the local level, winning control of city government in Istanbul and other places, hopefully heralding more success at the national level in the future. The same in India, which recently had an election. The Indian National Congress Party finally formed an alliance with several other parties that rolled back Modi and the BJP and the control that they had achieved in the previous election. As I mentioned, I study these cases because I want to have hope and to think about how we can learn from what parties have done in other places to help opposition parties in other electoral autocracies, which perhaps do not provide as much hope in the moment. Similarly, I think we should also more closely examine cases where incumbents were stopped in their tracks in their attempts at democratic backsliding. There are increasingly cases like this throughout Latin America, such as Brazil and Colombia. But we should study these phenomena with clear eyes, and in studying what occurred in Malaysia, I learned a few things. First, we may have to live with the notion that resistance or progress is a long-term process. In Malaysia, the 2018 opposition coalition did not materialize out of thin air. It resulted from years of learning through failed attempts to build coalitions at both the state and national levels. The process required political actors, politicians, party activists, to engage in trust building, but also to find ways to cooperate on the basis of mutual self-interest, even when trust was shallow. The best example of this principle is that the coalition itself was a combination of 4 incredibly strange bedfellows. 2 ethnic parties representing groups in tension with each other in Malaysia economically and socially, the Chinese and the Malays. And the other 2 parties were divided on the question of secularism and Islam in political and social life. So 4 parties that could not have been more ideologically distinct, yet willing to work together. A few of the larger parties in the coalition did their own internal polling to figure out what kinds of campaign messages worked best with voters. In particular, they were interested in the question we were studying. How do you get voters to engage in cross-party voting? One thing that came through in our conversations with candidates and party activists was that, quote-unquote, promoting democracy or, quote-unquote, resistance to authoritarianism were not messages that won support among voters. Voters cared about food and housing prices. They cared about language usage in schools and educational curriculum. They cared about government corruption, not the high-minded concepts that we as academics and practitioners often care about. So besides patience, resistance often requires strategic thinking, pragmatism, and compromise, because resistance is most effective when it is carried out in concert with others. Frank talked about cooperation among civil society organizations. I think equally crucial is cooperation among political parties. Whether they support the same goals, ideas, or have the same supporters, it is critical that they learn how to work together to get rid of incumbents backsliding or autocratizing. Of course, the coda to the story in Malaysia is that the coalition that came to power in 2018 in Malaysia fell apart a few years later amid bitter recrimination and disillusionment among voters. Once in power, the coalition found it hard to implement its campaign promises. First, because of its own internal squabbling. These were parties with very different policy ideas and ideologies, so when it came time to actually governing, they naturally found it difficult to do so. But also, second, because after decades of one party controlling the state bureaucracy, it was easily shown that it was difficult to simply steer the ship in a completely different direction. So what I saw was that even when resistance succeeds, against all odds, to topple a corrupt, repressive government, there is inevitably disappointment. All the promises that brought everyone working together to resist can never possibly be fulfilled. But this is not a reason to not try to resist. Perhaps it's just a reminder to temper our expectations and appreciate the value of change, even if it is not everything that we want it to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will manage the Q&A and... Okay, thank you so much, Professor Gandhi, for your insightful lecture. So I'm pretty sure that since we are all focused in a very specific geographic area, so we obviously were drawing parallels in our heads. And I even overheard some of the conversation already in the hall, so in the room. But anyway, let me open the floor for your questions to Professor Gandhi, please. Yes, Oliver.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Sarah Soki from the University of Colorado. And I had kind of two related questions. One was about what you were just talking about with sort of what do we know about when opposition parties are most successful in bringing down authoritarian regimes? So you talked about them cooperating with each other, which makes a lot of sense in some contexts, but does that have to coincide with changes in elites, changes in public opinion? Do you kind of have to have a confluence of kind of perfect factors that allow them to cooperate together in a way? And then, of course, you highlighted the governance problems. But then also, speaking to the first speaker, Frank Johansson, was talking about how one of the things they want to know more about at Amnesty International is how to prevent the wannabe autocrats from being elected in the first place. What do we know about, like, about how we would do that? Like, when we could have tempered optimism that we maybe could stop or head off electing wannabe autocrats? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for both questions. So to be fair, there are two events, the formation of an opposition coalition and then its ability to actually win at the polls under electoral autocracy or a democracy that's backsliding. That's the confluence of two pretty rare events. Unfortunately, history is littered with a lot of failures of parties to form coalitions. Failures as in they never get to the table to even discuss how to coordinate. Failures in the form of sometimes they form a coalition and then it disintegrates before the election. So I think it's often hard to study rare events in some sense and to be able to generalize because those events are, I wouldn't say unique, but not that common. I think one idea, though, in the literature is that some of these things, in terms of the behavior of the opposition, is very much endogenous to what's happening within the regime. So that parties don't really have any incentive to bear the costs of mobilizing their supporters to support a coalition. They don't have the incentives to sometimes give up their own designs on political power in order to support another member of the coalition, if they think that they have a realistic shot at winning at the polls, or at least coming close. If not winning directly, coming close enough to perhaps spur some sort of mobilization outside of the ballot box. So you're absolutely right in pointing out that there is an interaction in which parties are thinking about the likelihood of achieving something close to victory, and they're not going to embark on that process unless they think that chance is real. Your second question about how to prevent backsliding. From my knowledge, I think there are sort of two ideas that dominate the literature at this point. One is to sort of increase civic education amongst voters. Right, to basically remind people about why democracy is important. As Margarita said at the very beginning of the ceremony, to remind people that there's something valuable about a system in which we can process our political conflicts without killing each other, even if that system does not provide all of the good things that we want. The second idea, however, is simply that, well, maybe democratic governments need to work harder at producing things that voters want, right? So they need to address people's daily needs. They need to pay attention to their policy concerns. They need to reach out not just to swing voters, but also not take for granted their base. And as a result, this is the only way that we can prevent people from actually succumbing to the siren song of backsliders. But thank you for the questions.
Second, let me pass you the mic.
Thank you, Julia Lerner from Ben Gurion University, Israel. First of all, thank you very much. It was so compelling, so important, so interesting, and so helpful because it actually gave us, I think, some analytical tools and the ideas that we can apply and translate to many societies. Even I was thinking about my own quasi-democracy in the Middle East, which is actually almost all of the processes, most of the processes that you described, I can translate into understanding of this society and the country. But my question was, I really appreciated the challenge of your, in your approach, the challenge of the focus on the leaders and adding the elites, and the challenge of blaming the citizens, adding their, you know, making them less naive as they appear. But I would question one aspect that seemed to be not even lacking from your talk, but you mentioned this more in the, as everything is built on the pragmatism as an ideology. So I would ask you about the role of the, do we either talk today about the role of ideologies? Because we, in our post-ideological world, we talk about politics without ideology, but with propaganda. But at the same time, we see in the different societies, and of course in Russia, and of course in Israel, and maybe in Malaysia as well, that all these processes are actually based and led by very profound and very deep cultural ideas, maybe not ideologies, but ideas, which also mobilize people and citizens. So how do you see these cultural ideas? What characterize them? Yes? What are they today? And I'll stop here because the other question that I have is different. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question and observation. I sort of thought about the question of ideology and as it being more of an obstacle to things when I think about parties cooperating, sort of getting stuck on their ideological differences and therefore refusing to join coalitions with each other. I also sort of thought about ideology as an obstacle if you're thinking about building a campaign to convince voters. Maybe the idea should be to emphasize simple ideas of good governance as opposed to ideology. But I think your comment raises an important point, which is how do we square that idea with the fact that leaders, candidates, often come to power with very strong ideologies, right? Populist ideologies, neocolonialist ideologies. And so if it's in fact the case that voters really don't want to hear more about saving democracy or promoting democracy as an ideology, how is it that they are attracted to other ideological forms? And I think it's a great question. Thinking about voters, I've also been inspired a little bit by what's happening in the United States, because there's been a big debate in the Democratic Party as to what's the most effective way to reach voters in trying to defeat Trump. Biden's rhetoric was very much about saving democracy. And a lot of people, especially at the local and state levels, have simply said that that message doesn't resonate with voters at all. And so actually, while Biden was the presidential candidate, and even under Harris, there's less emphasis on that, I think, in the local races and state races. I'm from Wisconsin, which is a swing state right now, so it's hotly contested there. And there's much more emphasis on, again, topics related to good governance, kind of basic, everyday meeting of people's needs. It's a great observation and question.
Yeah, thank you. Michael Rochlitz from the University of Oxford. Last week, the German magazine Der Spiegel published an article about Elon Musk as being possibly a much bigger risk or in the future for democracies than what we have seen in the past, because we have this new type of business people who have enormous monetary resources, who control key technologies, so social networks, but also rockets, cars, whatever. And so we have a couple of them, and then kind of emerged in recent years. So how would you see the risk of these people for democracies in the future?
Thank you. I see them as tremendously risky. I mean, this relates to the point that I made somewhat in passing, which is that for political scientists who study autocracies, there's been a lot of emphasis on trying to understand the relationship between leaders and elites. And so it's a little bit don't know, puzzling or kind of interesting to see that people who focus on the democratic backsliding cases often don't have the same focus. So the focus is more on the leaders, the focus is on citizens, but I think you're absolutely right. It's these sorts of financial elites, other types of elites who are critically important. In the US case, you can think of Elon Musk. I think he's sort of the face of this movement, but there are many others in Silicon Valley, other more traditionally moneyed interests. So we sort of have the sense that there is this financial elite that is definitely bankrolling this movement. Not so much because they care about disillusioned voters who are supporting people like Trump, but because they think that that kind of government is going to deliver the types of policies and rents that they want, right? So I think that's critically important. In the US case, I also find really interesting that there isn't more of a spotlight on other elites within the Republican Party, because for sure they have enabled the rise of Trump and other sorts of candidates like him. And so I think you're absolutely right. There should be more focus on those types of elites. Presumably, it should be a little bit easier to study them in democracies that are backsliding, because maybe the sources of information are still available in a way that they are not always in autocracies.
Mikko Lohikoski from Finland. Thank you very much for your presentation, very insightful. I have a bit different question than the previous ones. Many of the nation states, especially in Africa, are rather artificial. They were created by colonial pens. And they have a lot of different minorities, different religions, whatever. And also many of the political parties are rather artificial around some leaders. Would there be a way to promote democracy and participation through different types of structures, especially in bigger countries where you would have regional autonomies, and also by strengthening of local authorities, which very often are missing any real means to develop? We have learned in Finland at least that a strong local government is very important in the system of democracy.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think on the topic of local actors, it depends on democracy at what level. My colleague Kate Baldwin, who does a lot of work on sub-Saharan Africa, actually has looked into how local chieftains could be a source of support for democratic deliberation and participation at local level decision making. But those same actors who promote some democratic practices at the local level often are allied with the governing party at the national level. And so while they are actors who are arguably critical for promoting some democratic practices locally, they are also the same actors who are perfectly happy to perpetuate not democracy at the national level. So, thinking about the incentives of local actors, I think, can be a little bit tricky. As for regional actors, I suspect it depends on kind of the composition of regional organizations and the regime types of those regional organizations. I mean, I think one of the sort of difficulties of the African Union, for example, is that it's populated by many states who have questionable democratic credentials, and as a result, they have very little incentives to try to promote democracy in other countries in the region. And so I think that that's going to be kind of a perpetual challenge in thinking about how regional organizations could play a role. Aside from the fact that probably member states are also very hesitant about doing things that infringe on state sovereignty.
Hi, I'm Ben Nathans from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. Thank you for a terrific and very clear talk. In the course of your remarks, you mentioned two learning processes. One, how political scientists have come to study autocratic regimes and the resistance to them, and the other, how opposition parties or civil society groups have learned gradually to cooperate with each other. I want to ask you about a third learning process. How do autocracies learn from each other? Do they study each other? Are they monitoring their techniques and testing them for success and failure? And is it possible to extend from a comparative study of different political systems to one that looks at interactions between them? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think there's definitely evidence that autocratic governments have learned from each other. In my sort of view of at least the scholarship in political science, it seems to be learning about how to respond to mass protest and mobilization. So if you think about all of the optimism that arose with the colored revolutions and how that then played a role in other autocratic governments deciding that the minute any sort of mass mobilization occurs, the best thing to do is to squash it, lest it unfold into something like a revolution. I know of some work on China where it seems that the Chinese government very clearly learned that lesson from observing what happened during the colored revolutions. I also think about that learning process in conjunction with the Arab Spring and sort of all the optimism that people had about how social media and technology could be used by civil society organizations and even less organized groups, right, to somehow come out on the street and overthrow a regime. Well, governments learned from that as well. They learned how to manipulate social media, how to have trolls and disinformation and all sorts of strategies to basically prevent or at least offer a counter-narrative to what the opposition were doing. They also worked to perfect their techniques of surveillance because they realized that social media and technology could help solve logistical problems for protesters. So I think you're right that, just thinking about protest and mobilization, there's a lot less reason for optimism, in part because it's very clear that autocratic governments have kind of learned from those cases to basically deal with mobilization very quickly and repressively from the beginning.
Thank you. Asel Dolatkildieva, I'm from Central Asia, Kazakhstan. Thanks very much for your presentation. I would like to raise, though, a methodological challenge. In the majority of the world, formal institutions such as political parties, civil society, NGOs, organizations are shallow. Do not exist or are just a formality. Also due to the authoritarian politics, that regimes do everything to suppress such organizations from emerging. Yet this is not just the case of Central Asia, but many, many other countries in the world. Yet those regimes, whether we like them or not, because they suppress democracy, yet they also strive and often manage to provide social cohesion. Central Asia is a very stable region compared to current situation in the world, which is also cherished by citizens. And do you still think that comparative politics is well equipped with tools, methodology, concepts to study such authoritarian politics in the world, in the areas of the world which are not institutionalized and cannot provide such clear-cut indicators, such political parties? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think it's a good one, in part because, as I mentioned before, during the Cold War, when a lot of dictatorships simply outlawed these types of institutions, it was very easy to kind of label them as closed autocracies or dictatorships. And now we have electoral autocracies, which, kind of going off of your comment, arguably maybe separates into two types. Those where there is some degree of institutional plurality, where there is some level of competition, where the story I told you about how the opposition could cooperate and lead to something bigger and better is a possibility. And other types of electoral autocracies, which now have sort of formal elections and parties and things like that, but these developments seem very far from a reality. They're very similar to what were previously thought of as closed autocracies, right? But they now have these institutions like democracies, although they don't function very much like elections in democracies. Whether we have tools to study them, I think we will fall back on sort of the tools that people use when they were studying sort of completely closed autocracies before. And as you point out, there are real methodological challenges. For one, it's often difficult to study politically sensitive questions in these countries. It's often the case that in order to do really detailed, in-depth work, or to do sort of in-depth data analysis like I do, you almost have to work very historically to a period which is not seen as politically sensitive, or you have to focus on a case in which the dictatorship has fallen. And so, yes, it leaves kind of a space in which we have more closed autocracies with less information, with more political sensitivity that makes it much more difficult to study. I'll just reflect that I see this in my students studying China. There are a lot of people who have stopped asking politically sensitive questions about China. Instead, they are studying historical topics, like how the bureaucracy was organized under the Qing dynasty. Or they are studying topics that they can get information from open sources, like China's foreign policy, simply because the space is closed to study these types of cases.
Hello, my name is Jeff Kahn. I'm a law professor from Southern Methodist University. Thank you very much for this interesting talk, which I thought was very much in conversation with Frank Johansson's opening remarks. He said that naming and shaming not only doesn't seem to work anymore, but might be counterproductive, which struck me as, I was surprised because that struck me as the bread and butter of human rights organizations since at least the Helsinki Final Act. But he's in a much better position than I am to know the practicalities of it. But then you said that suggesting that saving democracy is just not a winning political plank for parties and opposition parties or even incumbent parties compared to issues like housing or food or other issues like that. And then in response to Michael Rochlitz's insightful question, this seemed to control as well for those who might have very different degrees of education or financial interest who also are willing to support electoral autocracies or democratic backsliding. So I'm wondering if you think there are relevant questions that we're not asking about why what was suggested to us at the opening, in the opening remarks as a self-evident value of democracy as preventing us from violent encounters to resolve our differences just doesn't seem to be so self-evident to such large swaths of people, voters, without regard to education, wealth, or other variables that we might control.
Thanks, that's a great question. I think it's sort of the million-dollar question as to how to actually get voters to kind of think about the value of democracy. One sort of anecdote about this that doesn't answer your question, but simply reflects the dilemma. The recent election in Argentina that brought to power Milei, who is someone who has denied that 30,000 people were killed under the last military regime. Well, his candidacy had huge support amongst young people, people who probably didn't remember what the dictatorship was like, who weren't alive during the dictatorship, which is understandable, but it's also interesting because I know that the educational system in Argentina does actually make a point to talk about what happened under the military regime. And there are days of remembrance, and there's a tremendous effort to bring former perpetrators of repression to justice through national trials. So you have all of these things going on that you would think would remind people about how horrible not having democracy was, and yet people forget or they don't know. The other part of that case, though, that there's another version of how to explain what happened there, which is that Argentine society was always incredibly divided between the left and the right, and that the military coup and the regime was supported by a lot of voters and political actors on the right who to this day have kind of a sentimental view of that period. And so it's not just about kind of civic education, but it's also just polarization. And as I alluded to, the fact that it's not just state versus society, it's about different groups within society deciding that the rules that enable us to process conflict peacefully just don't matter anymore, that they're willing to roll the dice and try to settle it in another matter or in another way.
Okay, thank you so much. So I really appreciate your questions, and my apologies to all of you actually whose hands I unintentionally ignored. It wasn't my purpose, but unfortunately we ran out of time. Thank you so much again for your insightful lecture and answers.